Dean Martin had learned over the years that there were two kinds of late-night phone calls. The first kind came with laughter already baked into the receiver. Frank calling after midnight with a joke he'd been saving all evening. Sammy needing an audience, someone drunk and alive and very sure tomorrow could wait. The second kind came quiet. No laughter, no music in the background, just breathing. At 11:23 p.m., when the phone rang in Dean's Beverly Hills living room, he knew immediately which kind this was. He let it ring once, twice. The ice in his glass had melted enough that the drink tasted thin now, watered down like the evening itself. He'd been sitting alone for hours, lights low, the television on without sound. Divorce papers lay folded on the far end of the coffee table, unopened. He didn't need to read them to know what they said. On the third ring, he picked up. Yeah. There was a pause, a long one. Dean could hear breathing on the other end, uneven, shallow, like someone had just run a long way and didn't know how to stop. Dean, the voice said, "It's Elvis." Dean straightened in his chair. Not because of who it was, fame had never impressed him much, but because of how the voice sounded. Elvis Presley wasn't supposed to sound like this, not uncertain, not hollow. "What's wrong, kid?" Another pause, then quietly, almost carefully, "I need to see you tonight." Dean glanced at the clock, almost midnight. "Elvis, it's late." "I know." "Can it wait?" "No." One word, flat, final. Dean closed his eyes. He'd heard that tone before in men who were circling something dark, something irreversible. "Where are you?" "Beverly, Wilshire, room 847. The line went dead. Dean sat there for a moment longer, phone still in his hand. Outside, the city hummed softly, indifferent. Lowe's Angels always sounded calm at night, like it had already forgiven itself for whatever it would do tomorrow. He didn't want to go, that was the truth. He was tired of being the responsible one, tired of other people's crises spilling into his quiet. But he put the glass down anyway. Some friendships didn't let you choose comfort. The hotel hallway on the 8th floor smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old smoke. Dean's shoes made no sound as he walked toward the room. No laughter, no voices, just the low mechanical hum of the building breathing. He knocked. The door opened immediately. Elvis stood there like he'd been waiting inches away, hand already on the handle. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. His hair was still sculpted into its familiar shape, but it had lost its authority, strands falling loose, damp with sweat. His eyes were red, not from sleep. Dean took him in quickly. Wrinkled stage clothes, makeup smudged at the collar, the faint chemical smell of pills beneath the alcohol. "Come in," Elvis said. The room looked like a storm had passed through and decided to stay. A lamp lay shattered near the bathroom door. The minibar stood open, bottles half empty, some tipped over and bleeding into the carpet. A chair had been thrown, hard into the wall, leaving a dent that would never quite come out. Dean stopped just inside the door. "Jesus, Elvis." Elvis didn't answer. He paced, back and forth, hands clenching and unclenching like he was holding on to something invisible and losing his grip anyway. Dean closed the door behind him. "Sit down," he said. Elvis didn't. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Dean let the silence stretch. He knew better than to rush a man like this. Finally, Elvis stopped pacing. "I think Priscilla's lying to me." There it was. Not shouted, not dramatic, just dropped into the room like a fragile object that could shatter if anyone breathed too hard. Dean exhaled slowly. "About what?" Elvis laughed once, a short, humorless sound. "About everything." He walked to the window, pressed his forehead lightly against the glass. Outside, Lowe's Angels glittered, perfect, distant, unreal. "She doesn't look at me anymore," he said. "Not really. It's like I walk into a room and she's already somewhere else." Dean leaned against the desk. "Elvis, you've been on the road nonstop." "I know that," Elvis snapped, then softened. "I know, but this is different." He turned around. "She used to light up. I could feel it. Now it's like I'm a guest in my own house." Dean didn't interrupt. Men like Elvis didn't confess often. When they did, you let them empty the room. "She's got excuses," Elvis continued. "Always busy, always tired, always somewhere I'm not." Dean chose his words carefully. Loneliness doesn't always mean betrayal. Elvis stared at him. You didn't answer my call just to tell me that. Dean waited. Elvis took a breath. You had a party for Frank 3 weeks ago. Dean nodded slowly. Priscilla was there. Yes. You saw her. Yes. Elvis stepped closer now. Who was she with? There it was, the real reason for the call. Dean felt the weight of it settle into his chest. People talk at parties, he said carefully. Elvis shook his head. That's not what I'm asking. Dean looked at him, really looked. Not the performer, not the legend. Just a man standing in a wrecked hotel room, terrified of what he already suspected. I saw her talking to someone, Dean admitted. Elvis's jaw tightened. Who? A man I know, Mike. The name landed hard. Elvis turned away again, hands gripping the windowsill. How were they talking? Dean hesitated. And in that hesitation, everything shifted. They looked comfortable, he said finally, like people who know each other. Elvis closed his eyes. She said something about me, didn't she? Dean didn't respond immediately. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. She did, Dean said. Elvis turned back, eyes sharp now. What? Dean felt the old familiar ache, the one that came with being the man people trusted to tell the truth when lies would have been kinder. She said she doesn't recognize you anymore. Elvis didn't move. That the man she married feels gone. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Dean watched the words sink in, watched Elvis absorb them like a physical blow. She didn't say it to hurt you, Dean added quietly. She said it because she was hurting. Elvis sank onto the edge of the bed, hands covering his face. For the first time since Dean had known him, Elvis Presley looked truly unsure of who he was when no one was watching. After a long moment, Elvis spoke, voice muffled, exhausted. I need to go home. Dean's stomach dropped. Now? Yes. Dean straightened. Not like this. Elvis looked up. I can't sit with this. Dean stepped closer. If you go to her angry, drunk, and afraid, you won't get answers. You'll get damage. Elvis's eyes glistened. What if I already lost her? Dean placed a hand on his shoulder. Then tonight won't save it. Elvis stared at him, torn between impulse and reason. After a long moment, he nodded. Come with me. Dean didn't hesitate. All right. Sometimes being a friend meant boarding the plane, even when you knew where it was headed. The drive to the airport felt longer than it should have, as if the city itself were stretching the distance in protest, trying to give them time to reconsider. Los Angeles, usually so loud with nightlife and headlights, had gone half asleep, its streets open and strangely forgiving, like the world didn't want to witness what men did when pride and fear climbed into the same car. Elvis sat in the back seat with his shoulders rounded, the collar of his stage outfit still smelling faintly of sweat and cologne, his hands restless in his lap as though he were trying to hold onto something fragile that kept slipping through his fingers. Dean watched him in the rearview mirror now, and then, not staring, not gawking, just checking the way you check a friend who's bleeding internally and pretending he is. It wasn't the broken lamp in the hotel room that scared Dean, or the scattered bottles, or the rage that had made Elvis throw furniture like it weighed nothing. It was the way Elvis had gone quiet the moment Dean told him what Priscilla said. Rage was predictable. Loudness could be managed. But a man who went silent after hearing he'd become unrecognizable to the person who once loved him. That kind of silence could turn into anything. At Burbank, Elvis moved with the strange efficiency of someone who had rehearsed emergencies too many times. He didn't talk much while they walked through the small private entrance, his boots heavy against the floor, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if looking left or right might loosen the decision he'd already made. The pilot, groggy but obedient, appeared quickly, and within minutes the aircraft lights were on, engines prepping, a kind of sterile calm settling over everything, that calm the rich could buy even in the middle of a crisis. Dean climbed the steps behind Elvis and felt the air inside the cabin hit his face, cool, filtered, smelling like leather and faint fuel. Elvis dropped into the nearest seat and leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped as if praying without knowing who he was praying to. Dean sat across from him, close enough to reach if he had to, far enough not to crowd him, and watched the plane roll forward into the night like a confession being carried across the country. When they lifted off, Lowe's angels fell away beneath them, glittering and indifferent, the city shrinking into a scattered jewelry box while darkness swallowed the spaces between lights. Elvis stared out the window with the intensity of a man trying to locate something in the blackness, something he believed might be hiding just beyond the clouds. Dean had flown countless times, often with laughter, women, champagne, the bright, mindless comfort of celebrity routines. This flight felt nothing like those. It felt like a corridor leading to a door that might not open the same way twice. Elvis didn't touch the drinks offered by the attendant at first, and that worried Dean more than if he had. A man refusing the bottle wasn't always a sign of clarity. Sometimes it meant he had crossed into the part of grief where alcohol couldn't help anymore. Dean let the quiet stretch until it became unbearable. "Elvis," he said, gently, not as a lecture, more like a hand placed on a shoulder. "Talk to me, tell me what you're thinking." Elvis didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the window, reflecting only the faint cabin light and the vague silhouette of his own face. "I'm thinking," Elvis said finally, voice low and scraped raw, "about how a person can be loved like I've been loved by millions and still be alone in the only room that matters." Dean's throat tightened at that because it was truer than any song lyric. Elvis turned slightly, still not fully facing him. "You know what it's like, Dean," he said. "People think the applause fills you up. They don't know it can make the emptiness echo louder." Dean swallowed and nodded once because there was no clever answer to that. You couldn't joke a man out of the realization that his fame had become a kind of distance between him and the people he wanted most. Elvis's voice sharpened as the thought grew claws. "She said I'm gone," he muttered, then repeated it as if testing the words for weight. "She said the man she married is gone." He looked down at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "How does that happen, Dean? How do you wake up one day and find out you've turned into a stranger in your own life?" Dean had known men who asked that question too late. He tried to answer honestly without cruelty. "It doesn't happen in one day," Dean said. "It happens in little pieces. You give a little of yourself away to the road, to the work, to the people around you. You start believing you have to be the version of yourself everyone expects, and you don't notice what you're losing until someone you trust tells you they can't see you anymore." Elvis flinched as if those words stung because they were near the truth. "I never meant to leave her," Elvis whispered. "I never meant to leave my kid. I just kept thinking, one more show, one more residency, one more contract, and then I'll come home and everything will be fine." He laughed bitterly, then looked up at Dean with eyes wet and furious. "But it's never one more, is it? There's always another." The plane's hum became a kind of heartbeat under their conversation, steady and uncaring. Elvis rubbed his face roughly, then straightened, suddenly animated by something sharp. "And this Mike," he said, the name coming out like a splinter. "Karate instructor. Hollywood's full of guys who make a living touching other people's wives and calling it training." Dean's instincts told him to correct the ugliness in that statement, but he knew better than to scold a man who was bleeding. Instead he said, "I don't know what's happened between them, Elvis. I know what I saw, and I know what she said, that's all." Elvis stared at him. "You think she's in love with him?" Dean hesitated because this was a moment where a single word could become a weapon. "I think she's lonely," Dean said carefully. "And loneliness makes people reach for warmth wherever they find it. That doesn't always mean love. Sometimes it means survival." Elvis's jaw tightened again. "And what about me?" he asked, voice cracking in a way that made Dean's chest tighten. "What do I do with my loneliness? Because I've been lonely too, Dean. I've been lonely in rooms filled with people clapping for me." Dean wanted to say something comforting, something easy, but he knew easy words were just sugar on a wound. "You tell her the truth," Dean said. "Not the accusations, not the rage, the truth." Elvis blinked. "What truth?" Dean leaned forward slightly. "Tell her you're scared," he said. "Tell her you miss her. Tell her you don't know how to come back from the distance you've built, and then listen, really listen." Elvis looked away again. "If I listen," he muttered, "I might hear something I can't live with." Dean nodded. "That's the risk," he said quietly. "But the other risk is worse. The other risk is you talk at her instead of with her, and you guarantee the thing you fear." Elvis's hands trembled again, and he opened and closed them as if trying to release the tremor through his fingertips. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted. "I don't know if I can be calm." Dean's voice stayed steady. "Then I'll be calm for you," he said. "That's why I'm here." They landed in Memphis before dawn, the wheels touching the runway with a thud that felt like the end of a long inhale. The air outside was different from California's softened night, thicker, heavier, carrying the smell of damp earth and the faint bite of early morning chill. Elvis's car waited for them like it always did, because Elvis lived in a world where nothing was allowed to be unprepared. As they drove through the quiet city streets, Dean watched Elvis's face change in the darkness, as if being back in Memphis rearranged something inside him. He wasn't the man in the hotel room now. Here, with familiar roads and old shadows, he looked like a boy returning to the place he first learned how to want more than he had. But the boy and the king were tangled together, and Dean could see the struggle between them. Graceland appeared in the dim light like a memory made into architecture. The gates opened, and they rolled up the drive, the mansion's white columns looming, beautiful and haunting in the early morning gray. One upstairs light was on. Dean noticed it immediately, and so did Elvis. His face tightened. "She's awake," Elvis murmured. Dean didn't know if that was relief or dread in his voice. They went inside quietly, the house silent except for the soft echo of their footsteps on the thick carpet. Dean's mind flicked to the sleeping child somewhere in the house, and his stomach tightened again. Marriages could collapse quietly, but children always heard the noise eventually. They climbed the stairs, and Elvis stopped outside the bedroom door, hand hovering near the knob, his breath shallow. For the first time since the hotel room, Elvis looked uncertain, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff realizing he hadn't actually decided to jump. He'd only been running too fast to stop. Dean leaned close and spoke softly, because loudness would break the fragile control Elvis was holding. "You can still wait," Dean whispered. "You can still do this in daylight." Elvis shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. "If I wait," he whispered back, "I'll talk myself out of it, and then I'll keep living in the lie." He knocked. The door opened after a moment, and Priscilla stood there with her hair loose and her face bare, wrapped in a robe that looked too thin for the chill in the air. Her eyes widened when she saw Elvis, then widened again when she saw Dean behind him. Confusion flashed across her face first, then worry, then something deeper, an instinctive fear that something irreversible had arrived with them. "Elvis," she said, voice hushed, as if afraid to wake the house. "What are you doing here?" Elvis didn't answer with warmth. His expression had the controlled hardness of a man trying to keep his emotions locked behind his teeth. "We need to talk," he said. Priscilla's gaze moved to Dean. "Dean," she said quietly, and there was pain already in her tone, as if she understood without being told that he had become the messenger of something she never wanted delivered. "What is this?" Dean didn't speak. He didn't know how to say "I'm sorry" without making it worse. Elvis stepped past her and into the room, and Dean followed, not because he wanted to intrude, but because he'd promised he wouldn't let Elvis do this alone. Priscilla closed the door softly behind them. The room was calm, tasteful, almost too calm, like someone had tried to build a sanctuary inside a house that belonged to a storm. Elvis stood near the foot of the bed, shoulders rigid, eyes locked on Priscilla. "He told me what you said," Elvis said. Priscilla froze. The color drained from her face, and Dean saw the betrayal land in her eyes like a slap. "You told him?" she asked Dean, voice trembling. Dean opened his mouth, but Elvis cut in, the words spilling out with a force that had been building for hours. "Did you say you don't know who I am anymore?" he demanded. "Did you say the man you married is gone?" Priscilla's throat moved as she swallowed. For a moment she looked like she might deny it, might reach for the instinctive protection of quiet lies. But then her shoulders dropped and her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded once. "Yes," she whispered, "I said it." Elvis's face tightened, pain flashing so quickly it looked like anger. "Why?" he asked, voice breaking on the word. Priscilla took a shaky breath, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, like someone who had been holding her truth under water for too long and finally let it rise. "Because I'm tired," she said. "I'm tired of pretending we're okay when we're not. I'm tired of waiting for the version of you that used to look at me like I mattered." Elvis flinched. "I do look at you," he insisted, but the protest sounded weak, like a line he'd memorized rather than a truth he lived. Priscilla shook her head slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You look through me," she said. "You look at what I represent, you look at the wife, the image, the thing that proves you have a normal life, but you don't look at me, Elvis, not the way you used to." Elvis's hands clenched. "I've given you everything," he said, voice rising. "This house, security, a life people would kill for." Priscilla's expression tightened, and when she answered, her words came out with a quiet sharpness that cut deeper than yelling. "I didn't want things," she said. "I wanted you." Elvis went still, like that sentence had reached inside him and grabbed something tender. For a moment the room held its breath. Dean stood near the wall, feeling like a witness in a sacred, painful place where no one should be watching. But he stayed because Elvis's eyes kept flicking toward him, not for help with the argument, but for grounding, for reality. Elvis turned back to Priscilla, voice lower now, more dangerous because it was controlled. "And Mike," he said. "What about Mike?" Priscilla's eyes widened and her breath caught. "How do you know about Mike?" she asked, and the question itself was an answer. Elvis nodded slowly, as if confirming what he already feared. So there is something, he said. Priscilla shook her head quickly. It's not what you think, she whispered. Elvis took a step closer. Then tell me what it is, he said. Tell me in words I can live with. Priscilla pressed her fingers to her temple, as if trying to keep her thoughts from spilling too fast. He's my instructor, she said. That's all it was supposed to be. I started going because I needed something that was mine, something that wasn't this house or your name or the constant feeling that I exist as an extension of you. Elvis stared at her like he couldn't understand how a person could need something separate from him. So you chose a man, he said bitterly. You chose him to give you what I don't. Priscilla's voice shook. I didn't choose him, she said. I chose myself for once, and I didn't even know how to do that without feeling guilty. Elvis's eyes glistened again. Do you love him? He asked. The question hung there, heavy and terrible. Priscilla didn't answer immediately, and in that delay Dean saw the true fracture, not the presence of another man, but the absence of certainty between husband and wife. When Priscilla finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I don't know, she said. I know he makes me feel seen. Elvis's face crumpled, and for a moment the king disappeared completely. He looked like a man who had been told he was no longer enough. Dean stepped forward slightly, unable to stay silent. This is bigger than him, Dean said, voice gentle but firm. This started long before him. Elvis turned toward Dean, anger flashing. Don't defend her, Elvis snapped. Dean held his gaze. I'm not defending anyone, Dean said. I'm telling you the truth. You came here for truth. Elvis's chest rose and fell, and he looked back at Priscilla. Have you been with him? He asked, the words harsh, desperate. Priscilla shook her head quickly, tears falling faster. No, she said. I haven't crossed that line. Elvis's laugh was bitter. But you wanted to, he said, not as an accusation, but as a wounded conclusion. Priscilla didn't deny it. She lowered her head, and the silence admitted what her mouth couldn't. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was holding years of unsaid sentences. Elvis turned away, pacing now, slower than before, like a man walking through rubble. I don't know how we got here, he said, voice hoarse. Priscilla's answer came softly, and it sounded like grief. We got here one day at a time, she said. Every time you left and came back different. Every time I tried to talk and you closed the door. Every time we pretended. Every time we chose survival over honesty. Elvis stopped pacing and stared at her. So what now? He asked. What do you want? Priscilla wiped her face with trembling hands. I want space, she said. I want to breathe without feeling like I'm disappearing. I want to figure out who I am outside of being your wife. Elvis's jaw tightened. And where does that leave me? He asked. Priscilla looked at him, eyes full of sorrow. I don't know, she whispered. That's what scares me. I don't know what any of this leaves us. Dean watched Elvis's shoulders slump slightly, like something inside him had finally accepted that control was an illusion. The man who could command crowds, who could fill stadiums with a single song, couldn't command his own home back into place. Elvis's voice softened, almost childlike. I loved you, he said. Priscilla's lips trembled. I know, she whispered. And I loved you too, but love isn't supposed to feel like loneliness. Elvis closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked like he might fall apart completely. Dean stepped closer, quietly, offering his presence without interrupting, the way you do when someone is standing at the edge of grief and you can't pull them back with words. When Elvis opened his eyes again, something had shifted, not healed, not solved, but changed. He looked at Priscilla with a tiredness that felt older than his years. If I leave, he said quietly, will you stop seeing him? Priscilla nodded quickly, almost desperately. Yes, she said, I will, I swear, I don't want to hurt you. Elvis's mouth tightened. You already did, he said, not cruelly, just honestly. Priscilla flinched. Dean felt that flinch in his own gut because he knew pain didn't always come from malice. Sometimes it came from two people failing each other while still caring. Elvis turned slightly toward Dean, as if seeking the anchor again. What do I do? He asked. Dean answered the only way he could, with the blunt gentleness of a man who'd watched too many loves die in slow motion. You don't decide your whole future in one night, Dean said. You step back, you breathe, and you stop turning this into a war. If you want any chance to save what's left, you do it sober, and you do it with honesty, not fury. Elvis stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly he nodded. Priscilla's shoulders sagged with relief mixed with grief. Elvis didn't touch her. He didn't pull her into his arms like in the movies. He just stood there as if contact might burn. I'll go, he said quietly. Priscilla covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling again. I'm sorry, she whispered, and it sounded like someone apologizing for drowning while begging for air. Elvis's eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them. I don't know who I am either, he said softly. Maybe that's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Priscilla looked at him, and for a brief moment Dean saw the ghost of the old connection, two people recognizing each other's pain. But recognition wasn't enough. It never was. They left the room quietly, the house still asleep around them, and as they descended the stairs, Dean felt the strange weight of what they had just witnessed. No screaming match, no dramatic punch, no cinematic ending, just two people confessing in the half-light of morning that something sacred had been eroding for years. Outside, the sky was turning pale, and birds had started calling, ordinary life beginning as if nothing monumental had happened. Elvis walked toward the car with his shoulders hunched, moving like someone carrying an invisible load too heavy to set down. Dean followed, heart heavy, knowing that some truths didn't free you. Some truths simply made the cage visible. As the car pulled away from Graceland and rolled back toward the airport, Elvis stared out the window, silent again. Dean didn't force conversation. He understood now that Elvis wasn't thinking about Mike, or even about betrayal in the simple sense. He was thinking about the worst kind of fear, that the person you became might be the reason the person you loved couldn't stay, and there was no applause in the world that could drown out that thought. The flight back to California unfolded in near silence, the kind that presses against your ears until you become aware of your own breathing. Elvis sat with his head turned toward the window again, but this time he wasn't searching the darkness for answers. He was watching the sky lighten, inch by inch, as if daylight itself might explain something the night could not. Dean stayed where he was, saying nothing, because he had learned long ago that there was a difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed protecting. This was the second kind. Elvis wasn't angry now. The fury that had fueled the drive to Memphis had burned itself out, leaving behind something more dangerous in its calmness, acceptance mixed with grief. Dean recognized it immediately. It was the stage after denial, after bargaining, when the mind begins quietly rearranging its future without asking permission from the heart. When they landed, Lowe's Angels looked the same as it always did. Palm trees silhouetted against a pale morning sky, streets already waking up, people beginning ordinary days without any idea that somewhere nearby a marriage had cracked open in the dark. Elvis moved through the airport with mechanical politeness, nodding at staff, answering questions with short responses, his voice controlled and distant. It struck Dean how practiced Elvis was at this version of himself, the public-facing calm that masked whatever chaos was happening inside. Dean wondered how many years Elvis had been living like this, splitting himself into manageable pieces so no one had to deal with the whole man at once. Outside, the sun was fully up now, and the warmth hit Dean's face as they stepped toward the car. Elvis paused briefly, as if unsure where he was going next, then slid into the back seat. The driver asked where to go, and Elvis hesitated just long enough for Dean to notice before giving the address of the Beverly, Wilshire again. It felt strange, returning to the same place they had left only hours earlier, as if the night had folded in on itself, bringing them back to the beginning with nothing resolved and everything changed. Dean watched Elvis in the mirror as they drove, noticing the way his shoulders slumped slightly, the way his eyes had lost their edge. This wasn't defeat exactly. It was something quieter, something that settled in slowly like dust after a collapse. Back in the hotel room, the damage from the night before seemed even more stark in daylight. Broken glass glinted sharply on the carpet, and the overturned furniture looked less dramatic and more pathetic now, like evidence of a tantrum that had already exhausted itself. Elvis stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in, then sighed deeply, a long breath that sounded like surrender. "I did this," he said softly, not accusing, just stating a fact. Dean nodded. "You were hurting," he replied. Elvis shook his head. "That's not an excuse," he said. "It's just the reason." He bent down and began picking up pieces of glass with his bare hands, and Dean quickly stopped him, guiding him to a chair and calling for help instead. Watching Elvis sit there, obedient and quiet, while staff came in to clean up the wreckage felt symbolic in a way Dean couldn't quite articulate. It was like watching a man finally allow other people to handle the mess he'd made, even though he'd built his entire life on never letting that happen. They didn't talk much that day. Elvis slept for a few hours, the deep, heavy sleep of someone whose body had finally run out of adrenaline. Dean stayed, sitting near the window, reading a newspaper he didn't really absorb, keeping one ear tuned to Elvis's breathing, making sure it stayed steady. When Elvis woke, his eyes were clearer, but the sadness hadn't lifted. It had just settled into a more permanent shape. He didn't reach for pills immediately, and Dean noticed that too. Instead, Elvis sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his face as if trying to wake himself into a new reality. "She wasn't wrong," Elvis said suddenly, voice rough from sleep. Dean looked up. "About what?" he asked. Elvis stared at the carpet. "About me being gone," he said. "I've been running from myself for a long time." Dean folded the paper and set it aside, giving Elvis his full attention. "You don't have to keep running," Dean said gently. Elvis laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted. "Every time I slow down, everything catches up to me." Dean understood that too well. Slowing down meant hearing the thoughts you'd been drowning out with noise, applause, schedules, substances. It meant facing the quiet and realizing it had teeth. Over the next few weeks, Elvis tried, in his own uneven way, to do what Dean had suggested. He reduced his appearances, pushed back on a few commitments, and most notably began seeing a therapist, something he would have mocked years earlier. He didn't talk about those sessions much, but Dean could tell they were leaving marks. Elvis grew more reflective, less reactive. The explosive moods didn't disappear entirely, but they softened around the edges. There were days when Elvis called Dean late at night. Not drunk, not frantic, just tired, wanting to talk about nothing in particular. They spoke about music, about movies, about the strange loneliness of being known by everyone and understood by almost no one. Sometimes Elvis talked about Priscilla, but not in the accusatory way he had before. He spoke about her as a person now, not as an extension of his own life. That shift alone told Dean something important had changed. Priscilla, for her part, stayed in Memphis. She kept her promise and stopped seeing Mike, not dramatically, not with declarations, but quietly, the way people end things when they know the ending isn't really about the other person. She spent more time alone, more time with her daughter, more time sitting with questions she had avoided for years. For the first time since she was a teenager, her life didn't revolve around anticipating Elvis's schedule or adapting herself to his moods. That freedom terrified her as much as it relieved her. There were nights when she missed him fiercely, not the man he had become, but the man he once was, the one who had looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a world spinning too fast. But memory, she was learning, could be a dangerous place to live. When Elvis and Priscilla spoke during that time, their conversations were careful, almost formal, like two people walking through a room filled with broken glass. They talked about their daughter first always because that was the safest ground. They talked about practical things. Sometimes, tentatively, they talked about feelings, but those conversations often ended in silence, not from anger, but from the shared understanding that honesty didn't automatically rebuild what it exposed. Dean watched this from a distance, carrying the strange guilt of being the man who had opened the door to these conversations. He knew, intellectually, that the truth would have surfaced eventually. Emotionally, though, he still felt like he had tipped the first domino. One evening months later, Dean and Elvis sat together in Dean's living room again, the same space where the phone call had come that night. The room looked unchanged, but Dean felt older sitting there, as if the air itself remembered what had been said. Elvis nursed a drink slowly, more ritual than escape now. "We tried," Elvis said quietly, staring at nothing in particular. "Counseling, time together, talking without yelling." Dean nodded. "That matters," he said. Elvis shook his head. "It didn't fix it," he replied. "It just showed us how broken it already was." He took a sip, then set the glass down. "She's different now," he continued. "Stronger, quieter, like she's finally listening to herself instead of everyone else." There was admiration in his voice, tangled painfully with regret. "And you?" Dean asked. Elvis shrugged. "I'm trying," he said. "Some days I don't know who I am if I'm not on stage or fighting something." Dean leaned back, studying him. "You're allowed to be unfinished," Dean said. Elvis looked at him, surprised, then nodded slowly. "I'm learning that," he said. "It's harder than performing." When the divorce papers came, they felt almost anticlimactic. There was no dramatic explosion, no public spectacle at first, just a quiet acknowledgement that the work they had done hadn't been enough to close the distance. Elvis called Dean after he signed them. His voice was steady, subdued. "You were right," Elvis said. Dean frowned. "About what?" Elvis exhaled. "About waiting," he said. "About not blowing everything up in one night. We gave it a chance, a real one." Dean closed his eyes briefly. "I'm sorry," he said. Elvis was quiet for a moment. "Don't be," he replied. "It was already over, we just stopped pretending." In the months that followed, Dean watched Elvis change in small, uneven ways. He took fewer pills, not none but fewer. He asked more questions in conversations instead of filling the silence with stories. He laughed sometimes, real laughter unforced, usually at something small and human rather than something grand. There were still dark days, still nights when Elvis sounded lost on the phone, but there was also a growing sense that he was at least facing himself instead of running. Dean admired that more than any performance he'd ever seen. Priscilla eventually moved on, finding a life that belonged to her in a way it never had before. When Dean saw her once at a quiet gathering, she looked different too, less polished perhaps, but more present. She thanked Dean for listening to her that night at the party long ago, even though she knew it had set painful things in motion. Dean accepted her gratitude with a heavy heart because he understood now that sometimes listening was the most dangerous kindness you could offer. It changed people. It changed futures. Years later, after Elvis was gone, people asked Dean if he regretted telling him the truth. Dean always paused before answering because regret was too simple a word for what he felt. He regretted the pain. He regretted the timing. He regretted being the man standing between two people at the moment they realized love wasn't enough. But he didn't regret the honesty itself. Lies, Dean believed, only delayed the damage. Truth, even when it hurt, gave people the chance to stop living someone else's version of their life. Sometimes, late at night, Dean would think back to that phone call, to the sound of Elvis's voice on the edge of something dark. He would think about how easily he could have let the phone keep ringing, how easily he could have chosen comfort over responsibility. And every time he came back to the same conclusion: some friendships don't let you stay silent. Some friendships ask you to walk into the wreckage with the other person and stand there while they face what's broken. It doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you human. Time did what it always did in the aftermath of a private collapse. It moved forward without ceremony. The world did not pause to acknowledge the quiet end of a marriage that had once fascinated millions, and in that indifference there was both cruelty and mercy. Elvis returned to work because work had always been the place where he knew the rules, where applause arrived on cue and certainty lived inside the structure of a song. The stage still responded to him the way it always had, crowds rising to their feet, voices joining his as if nothing in his life had fractured at all. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The performances were sharper, sometimes more desperate, as if he were trying to outrun the echo of empty rooms, but there were moments too, small, unguarded ones, when his voice softened in a way that made Dean uneasy because it sounded like a man singing not to be loved, but to be understood. Dean watched this evolution from the sidelines, careful not to interfere unless asked. He had learned that once truth was delivered, it could not be managed or softened. People had to live inside it on their own terms. There were nights when Elvis called him after a show, the adrenaline still buzzing under his skin, and talked about how strange it felt to step off stage into silence, how the cheers evaporated the moment the dressing room door closed. Elvis spoke about how, for the first time, he was beginning to notice the absence rather than fearing it, though that awareness did not make the loneliness easier to bear. It only made it clearer. Dean listened without offering solutions, because he understood now that Elvis wasn't asking to be fixed. He was asking not to be abandoned in the process of becoming someone new. Priscilla's life unfolded more quietly, deliberately stripped of spectacle. She learned to live without anticipating Elvis's needs, without measuring her days by his schedule or his moods. The guilt did not vanish just because the marriage had ended. It lingered in unexpected places, in memories of laughter, in photographs that froze moments now unreachable. Yet alongside that guilt grew a fragile sense of self, one that did not require permission to exist. She found routines that belonged to her, friendships not filtered through fame, silences that felt restorative instead of threatening. The freedom she had once imagined as exhilarating revealed itself as complex and demanding, requiring courage she had never been encouraged to cultivate before. In the quiet, she learned something essential, that leaving a marriage did not mean erasing love, only accepting that love alone could not carry the weight of everything else. Elvis, too, was learning difficult truths. Therapy did not provide neat answers, but it did force him to sit still with questions he had avoided for decades. He began to recognize patterns in his life, the way he filled emotional gaps with work, with substances, with control. He spoke once to Dean about how frightened he had been of ordinary intimacy, how being truly seen by one person felt more dangerous than being adored by millions. That admission stayed with Dean because it revealed the quiet paradox of Elvis's life. The more visible he became to the world, the harder it was for him to let any single person see him completely. Fame had given him everything except safety. As the years passed, the public narrative simplified what had happened between Elvis and Priscilla, as it always did. People wanted villains and victims, clean explanations, dramatic reasons that fit neatly into headlines. Dean never corrected them. He understood that the truth was too layered for mass consumption. The truth was two people who loved each other but grew in directions that no longer aligned, two people who made mistakes without malicious intent, two people who stayed too long and then left too late. It was not scandalous. It was human, and perhaps that was why it was so difficult for others to accept. When Elvis's health began to decline more visibly, Dean noticed the shift before most people did. The exhaustion lingered longer, the recovery took more effort, the spark that once seemed endless flickered unpredictably. Elvis still performed, still pushed himself, because stopping felt like surrender. Yet there were moments, brief and startling, when Elvis spoke about slowing down, about wanting something quieter, something real. He talked about his daughter with a softness that suggested regret and hope tangled together, about wishing he could show her a version of himself not defined by expectation. Dean encouraged these thoughts gently, knowing how easily they could be swallowed by habit. The last conversations Dean had with Elvis were not dramatic. There were no grand revelations, no final confessions. They spoke about ordinary things, music that still moved them, movies that felt honest, the strange relief that came from being less busy. Elvis once said almost casually that he was grateful someone had told him the truth when it mattered, even if it hurt. Dean didn't ask him to elaborate. He understood what Elvis meant. Truth had not saved the marriage, but it had saved something else. Elvis's chance to see himself clearly, if only for a while. After Elvis died, the world responded the way it always did, with shock and mourning amplified by myth. People spoke about his talent, his generosity, his excesses, his tragic decline. They argued about what could have been done differently, as if lives could be edited in hindsight. Dean grieved privately. He did not attend to the noise. He remembered Elvis not as the legend frozen in photographs, but as the man who had called him late at night, frightened and unraveling, asking for honesty when lies would have been easier. That memory mattered more to him than any public tribute. Years later, when asked whether he regretted telling Elvis what Priscilla had said, Dean answered carefully, because the question itself misunderstood the nature of regret. He said he regretted the pain, regretted the timing, regretted that love had not been enough to bridge the distance that had grown between two people who once meant everything to each other. But he did not regret the truth. Silence, he believed, would have been a deeper betrayal. Silence would have allowed the illusion to continue while the damage worsened. Truth, even when it broke things, allowed honesty to enter a space that had been suffocating under pretense. Dean came to understand that some friendships ask more of you than comfort. They ask you to become the bearer of difficult knowledge, to risk being blamed, to stand in the aftermath of choices you did not make but helped reveal. Carrying that weight was not heroic. It was simply the cost of caring deeply enough to refuse a lie. In quieter moments, Dean reflected on how many people live entire lives avoiding the truth to preserve a version of happiness that is already eroding. He wondered how many marriages, how many friendships, how many identities dissolved not because of cruelty, but because of fear. What remained in the end was not scandal or blame, but understanding. Elvis and Priscilla had loved each other within the limits of who they were at the time. When those limits became too confining, the love could not expand enough to compensate. Accepting that did not mean the love was false. It meant it was finite. And finiteness, Dean believed, did not diminish meaning. It defined it. The story did not end with redemption or reunion because most real stories do not. It ended with people continuing to live, changed by what they had learned, marked by what they had lost, and shaped by the courage it took to face themselves. Honesty did not heal everything, but it made denial impossible. And sometimes, that was the most compassionate thing one person could offer another. In the quiet after everything, Dean often thought back to that first phone call, to the moment he could have let it ring. He understood now that answering it had altered several lives, including his own. He also understood that not answering would have been a choice too, one rooted in comfort rather than care. In the balance between those options, Dean found his peace. Truth had cost them all dearly, but it had also given them something rare: the chance to stop pretending and start living, however imperfectly, in what remained.